All right, so I'm really going to try hard not to read. I know you guys can all read, but just kind of give you the highlights. So this was a presentation that's created by Dr. Nike, and I have taken the liberty of adapting it quite a bit for my presentation. And so at the bottom of the slides that I've adapted, I've given him credit, but they're not exact copies. So I'll give him credit, but don't hold him accountable for any things that I say that are not from him. Next slide. I don't have any relevant financial relationships with anyone. I'm getting looks. Describe, the objective, I think for this whole session is to describe the best practices for improving adolescent immunization rates. That's actually what I'm going to talk about, but the next slide is specific to this session. So number one, learn how to plan a PDSA cycle. So I actually did not have Ruth's slides before planning my own, which means it's going to be even shorter than originally planned, because I didn't realize what a phenomenal job that Ruth was going to do in really walking you through every step of it. I'll offer kind of my, number two, pitfalls, and then 3 is the best practice strategies. So we're going to kind of work with PDSAs and think about PDSAs, but the actual process of how to PDSA, I probably just skip over because I can't come close to how well Ruth did on that part. Next slide. So using, you know what, I'm going to get rid of my chat box. Please somebody shout out if something ends up in the chat box, because it's really, really distracting.
Dr. Karras is going to be monitoring that for us if he's able to.
Okay, so using PDSA cycles to achieve quality improvement. To some extent, this is just a quick review of what we just went through with Ruth. Next slide. So she had this slide in her deck as well. This is an exact copy from Gunderson Health System, copyrighted. But again, just to reiterate, the steps, the things that you're thinking about are listed here in terms of, well, how do we even want to approach creating a PDSA? How do we want to approach just the tiniest little first change in this big giant project? And so these are, you have to think about what's the aim of the project, and then how does this aim contribute to improvement, and then take from there the specific little changes that we can start with, and then you put it through this PDSA cycle. Next slide. So these are my own. So more of the kind of practical on, okay, I've got this worksheet in front of me. What do I do? So choose an intervention. It doesn't have to be a specific test of change at this point. You're just big picture. What do I want to work on? So interestingly, I put together my own sample PDSA, and I picked exactly the same measure that Ruth picked. And it was pretty much exactly the same process that she showed you, although hers was way better than mine. So we'll skip through mine, but pick sort of a big picture. What do I, go back. What area do I feel like is something I can handle, or something that really needs to happen for our practice, or just, you're not going to solve the world's problems in your first PDSA, but what's kind of a comfortable and yet necessary place to start? So I picked missed opportunities and thinking about looking at catch-up immunizations at acute care visits, because that's something my practice doesn't do. And then kind of worked backwards on how little can I make this. So that's why I say plan a very small change related to this intervention and implement it on a very, very small scale. So I use that word implement, which is not the right word to use. I think make a change on a very small scale, but think little, tiny, not overwhelming. So you can go to the next slide. This is a big, giant, overwhelming slide, and you're not meant to read it. It's just to show you do have some help. So the project put together what we call a key driver diagram, and you can see there's a list of interventions for you to choose from. So you don't even have to reinvent the wheel. If you know something, oh, I want to work on this, great, do it. If you're like, I don't know where to start, read through this list and see if something piques your interest from that intervention. And then think about like, okay, well, what could I do in this area? You'll actually be asked on the worksheet about these secondary drivers and primary drivers. And that's just to kind of help you organize in your mind which area of the project are you working on. Next slide. And Ruth went over this really nicely. So you're going to use a PDSA worksheet to first plan the change that you're going to make, to to actually carry out that change according to your plan, study what happened during the PDSA cycle, what were your results, what worked, what didn't work, and then decide whether to adapt, or abandon the change. So Ruth did an amazing job on this. Next slide. So this was my sample that is almost exactly the same as Ruth's, and hers is better, so you can actually move on. Okay, and then Ruth talked about this as well, but based on the decided action, then you plan your next cycle. So she showed ramps. The kind of text version of her ramps is, so you did your cycle. Are you going to adopt it? Okay, this worked great, I think it's going to be a great change to keep working on. Instead of doing just one day or one doctor, let's see if we can increase that to a week and it still works. Or let's see if we can increase the number of doctors and see if it still works. And so you might do, honestly, 3 or 4 iterations of this until you get it to cover the entire group that you're ultimately planning for. But you don't want to think kind of that end point at the beginning, because that's way too overwhelming. If you're going to adapt, so then you're going to do 1, 2 more cycles of, well, let me make this little tweak with what didn't work and try again, and then abandon. You're just done with that, move on, pick a new change, and then you start all over. So it is a process of, cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle. You don't have to turn in all these cycles. You don't have to plan ahead 20,000 cycles. But if you keep in mind that, each intervention, big intervention that you want to consider for this project is probably going to take, 5, 6, maybe cycles to kind of get through, okay, what's really working for us, what's really not working for us, and then expand and adapt and expand and adapt. And then you're there with like, oh wow, now my entire office has adapted this change and we've completed this intervention. Let's move on to another intervention. Next slide. I think this is what I just said. You repeat until you're successful on a large scale, and you start new cycles with additional interventions when you've succeeded in your previous intervention. Next slide. So pitfalls. Again, Ruth has talked about some of this, but the biggest pitfall is just getting totally overwhelmed. It is totally overwhelming to think about the long-term goals of this project, increasing, the data we're putting in. I have to get those numbers up. It's totally overwhelming. And that leads into number 2, starting too large in objective or scale. So your first PDSA has to be tiny. It literally can be 1 patient. It can be 1 doctor. It can be for 1 hour, but something that's incredibly manageable, that's going to give you a starting place of what really did not work and what was helpful. And let me tweak this so that I can get a little closer to where I want to be and then start expanding to incorporate it on a larger scale. Number three, spending too long on each cycle and reiteration. So again, if you're doing, I'm just going to do one patient today, you can't really once a month do a one patient test of change and get anywhere. So, you do need to think a little bit about it. It doesn't have to be big scale, but it also can't be, snail speed. If you're going to do very small scale, once you figure out what works or you adapt it, you got to kind of keep moving to keep that process going until it really builds into something uh, bigger. And then failure to plan ahead to allow time to achieve multiple different project interventions. And that's, again, spending too long on one thing. So it doesn't mean you have to formally, I mean, I do always write out my PDSAs, because once you get used to using that form, it's nice just to have okay, this is what I'm doing this week or this day or whatever, but you're not going to have to turn in every single PDSA. You are going to have to turn in some PDSAs just to make sure that you're understanding how to use those worksheets and making some progress. But you want to kind of think ahead in terms of, I have maybe 2 months to sort of work with this bigger objective and 2 more months to work with this other objective, right? So that you make sure that you don't get so bogged down in one tiny little cycle of change that you end up at the last part of the project with, you haven't really accomplished very much. So it's important to keep an eye on the big picture, but to really focus on small and little details to not get overwhelmed. Next slide. Some more pitfalls: forgetting to ask important questions. It is important that the change that you pick is actually pertinent and will actually have some impact. It doesn't mean that every change you pick is going to have impact, but you should be thoughtful about, is there any reason for me to believe that if I make this change, this will actually improve reaching the goals for the overall project? And then failing to plan data collection early. I think this just really goes back to what Ruth was talking about in terms of that study part of the PDSA really is, did this work? And part of did this work is knowing, what are you asking? What kind of data do you need to collect to know if you were successful or not? And actually going through the process of collecting that data. And you could see from her presentation, it's not like, let's talk about KETA data on the big picture. It literally, for the example she gave, was they looked at 15 patients, or they were able to assess 15 patients qualified, I think, and 11, they were successful at assessing with 11. And then of those, they were successful at administering catch-up vaccinations for half, and planned for the other half. So even on a very small scale, knowing, what am I actually going to measure? What kind of results, or how am I going to know if this is something that's worth bothering to do? That really is just asking the questions more specifically and thinking more specifically in terms of, is this going to move me in the right direction? It's funny because the question I hated the most on the worksheet is, how do I know if this is an improvement? Because I think it's like, well, I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't an improvement. And I always struggle with how to kind of conceptualize that question. But I think what I'm actually saying right now is that you just got to be able to say that this is pertinent and this moves us in the right direction. So, the answer to that question, how do I know if this is an improvement, is your measures. Is there something that you can measure that shows that this moves you in the right direction according to your long-term goals? Next. So best practices, AAP CQN, so chapter quality network is what we're doing here. Actually, go to the next slide because I think it discusses it here. So in chapter quality networks, of which this is one, national AAP partners with AAP state chapters to achieve quality improvement goals. Ruth already talked about the model for improvement, which is what we're using. And so there have been many chapter quality networks previously. And out of one of those, National AAP developed a top 10 interventions for increasing immunization rates. This came out of a project in which they looked at immunization rates for children 19 to 35 months of age. But it's basically just kind of a list and an explanation of what works, what things to concentrate on, ideas for moving forward. So this and your PDSAs do not need to be limited to this list. If you can think of something else, great. But this is sort of a jumping point for things to consider that have been shown to work. Next slide. So I adapted all of these slides that they chunked these 10 top immunization interventions into these groups: missed opportunities, vaccine hesitancy, access, and measurement. And we'll go through each of those. Please don't count because so CQN put they didn't count everything either, and they kind of grouped them differently than conceptually made sense to me. And even when you look at theirs, they're not really 10. They counted some things that were 3 or 4 as one. And so regardless, I didn't, in my mind, I've managed to make it 10, and it actually is the same 10, but they're grouped differently. So if you think like, well, that doesn't seem like 10, well, it's not. Next slide. So missed opportunities at the individual healthcare provider level. Talked about a lot of this in Ruth's presentation. So things that have been shown to improve immunization rates. If you check immunization status at every visit type, if you immunize at every visit type, obviously we're all good at immunizing at preventive care visits. We're all super busy and don't really have a lot of time to be investigating shot records and what shots they might be overdue for at acute care visits. But there are a lot of ways to incorporate this into your standard workflow so that maybe it's, it's not the physician who's doing the heavy lifting, but there's a way to identify these patients, maybe not even right at that very point of care, but beforehand, to have a more systematic approach to, hey, this is something we look at every single visit and offer you the opportunity to become current on your vaccinations outside of the preventive care visit. And there's arguments, for why obviously preventive care visits are incredibly important. And so there should be, reasons why you might require a preventive care visit. And that's, that's for everybody to decide on their own and way beyond the scope of this project. But there are ways to systematically incorporate review of immunizations at acute care visits and even be able to catch some of these kids up on there. And then chronic care, most of the chronic care I do is behavioral health. And so I see those kids fairly regularly to check in on their medications, and I do a really great job of seeing when their well visit is, because I always make sure they keep up with their well visits. If it's due, I do it. But something I'm not doing routinely is actually looking at shot records during behavioral health visits. It'd be pretty easy to do and just incorporate that in. So that would be a PDSA for my office. Become familiar with true contraindications for vaccination. True contraindications are actually very rare. That is true. There's going to be some kids that you feel this kid is too sick or there's too much going on. There's certainly reasons not to do it, but true contraindications are actually incredibly rare. Next slide. Missed opportunities are more system-based. So we talked a little about alerts, reminders, and recalls. And at some point we should talk more about that. Every system is different and there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but alerts are when you bring up a patient's chart and it's kind of pushed in your face, this patient needs something. That can be really helpful. A reminder is when you remind something that a service is due, versus a recall is when something is overdue and you're kind of calling them back. So maybe like the 6-month dose of HPV, that would be a recall of, okay, we see in our system that you've reached your 6 months, come on in and get it done. Anything that can be done through your EHR, and they're all different. So, I mean, I think that we can probably troubleshoot with people about your specific EHR. And I think the fact that we're part of a national network, national can certainly, reach out to other chapters and other groups and find out if anybody's using the same EHR as you are. And that could be incredibly helpful. That's a huge benefit of belonging to a chapter quality network. But your EHR can do things for you in much more quickly with much less labor involved. So we do want to explore how can I use these alerts, reminders, and recalls with my current system to not have to do so much of the heavy labor myself. Implement systematic processes to improve the accuracy of immunization records and increase immunization rates. So the state registry, not everybody's on it and not everything is in there, but when it is, man, you have a whole record of what they've had. So find ways to integrate with the state immunization registry, not just to update or upload the immunizations you give, but to receive the information of immunizations that have been given elsewhere. And then standardizing processes specifically for scheduling follow-up vaccinations. So, like just to pick on HPV as an example, or even MenB could be an example, but something that's got a second dose that's, not too far in the future, if you don't want to wait until an entire year in the next well visit, start thinking about, well, at this visit, when we give this, let's automatically ask people to come back first. So we have what's called, well, I don't know why we call it over the board, which I don't even know what that means, but Jen's like, I don't know what that means either, but it's a walk-in visit and you have to meet certain criteria, meaning you're up to date on your well care. But you, if you've met that criteria, if you're not skipping out on services that we feel are critically important, you can actually just walk in and say, I'm due for my HPV dose. And we have a process for how that happens with standard orders. So even beyond that, though, we don't actually have a standardized scheduling process for when we give the first HPV, we ask them to come back. And there's reasons for that, and I'm not saying we even need to change that, but you could use scheduling, standardized scheduling to make that the norm of, well, everybody comes back at this time to get this second dose of this vaccine. Meningitis B is probably a better example. We do actually, we're pretty good on our MenB administration rates. That second dose, 30 days after the first dose, most of those kids we're not going to see for a year. And most of those kids, we do immunize them or give them their second dose at that next year's visit. But it only has to be 30 days, and we really could improve our completion rates probably quite a bit by really standardizing that in 30 days or in 45 days or whatever. We want you to come back for this type of visit, which would be just a walk-in visit at your convenience, just to get this done and out of the way. So we're not waiting a year and hoping that you come back. So whoever's taking notes from my group, that's another PDSA we need to do. All right, next slide. Other strategies. So initiate vaccine series at the earliest possible opportunity. We actually just did this a year ago, moved our HPV to 9 years. And I really did not know how well that was going to go. And I thought it was going to be a disaster. And really, I'm surprised at how much that sort of normalized HPV, that when you're talking about HPV at age 11 or 12 or 16, that becomes a different discussion than when you're at 9. You're just like, you're due for this and you're going to need a second dose, so we'd like to start it as soon as possible. I feel like, I mean, there's still plenty of people who say, no, I'm going to wait, but they can wait until 10 and we have the discussion again, and then 11 we have the discussion. I'm honestly surprised at the uptake of that 9-year HPV. It's certainly not 100%, but by the time you get to 11 years old, you're way closer to 100% than you were if you didn't even start it until 11. And then this last one, I'm not sure how one would actually put this into place. Collaborate with other potential immunization sites. People are getting vaccines at other places, and my practice does not have really a fantastic standardized way of incorporating those other places, getting those vaccines into our vaccine records. But I'm sure that there are some good PDSAs out there to approach this area if you feel like that would be a good opportunity for your practice. Next slide. Improve access. So if you're counting, this was actually all one of the top 10. And I didn't count it as all one. So anyway, don't count. Use standing orders and policies for vaccine-only visits. I mentioned that's something that we do in our practice. Consider expanded hours for preventive care visits. I know that's what we all want to do, is work more and more and more and more. And I imagine a lot of you are already doing this. But if you're not, think about, could I offer some walk-in visits even for vaccine-only visits, or preventive care visits earlier in the morning, later in the evening, a few hours on a weekend. Always an option if you're not already doing that, to just improve the access. And when you improve the access, particularly for working parents, you can often get your immunization rates up simply by getting your preventive visits up. Optimizing schedule and staffing to match demand. We're good at this in pediatrics, but maybe we don't always think about this as it relates to immunization. So we all know that flu kills us in the winter, and sports physicals kill us in the summer. But even just on a kind of more day-to-day, are there ways that we could adjust our schedule so that we have the right amount of staff to see the demand for the preventive care visits, much like we do with thinking about flu and thinking about summer schedules? Next. We're getting close. Address vaccine hesitancy. So we did talk about this quite a bunch. This is an area that I am very passionate about, and I became passionate through HPV, and I think it's the best example of addressing vaccine hesitancy. But anything that applies, most things that apply to HPV, really you could use for any vaccine hesitancy at any age. Use the same strategies and really break through a lot of barriers. So many years ago, my practice did really focus on HPV, and we did a lot of staff trainings and we did a lot of physician trainings. We created a video, which I don't even have anymore, but it was a pretty cool video with me and my daughter and my nurse at the time, and Bill Long put it to a Star Wars theme, and it was very, and it just was, we used it with our staff and with our physicians to how to change our language around HPV to overcome the vaccine hesitancy. And so, I think a lot of physicians probably do feel relatively comfortable in discussing HPV. Some do not, and my comfort has definitely increased over time as I've learned to kind of have that. I hate motivational interviewing, but it's really probably the best explanation of how I approach my personal conversations with families. And it is just, hey, is this something you're willing to talk about? And help me understand what your concerns are, and let me address those concerns. I compare HPV to meningitis all the time, that it's the same population is at risk, that the vaccines have been, they've really been around for about the same amount of time, that meningitis is required in schools because of how transmissible it is. The safety profile is very, very similar. I'll say things like, the HPV vaccine is one of the safest vaccines we've ever had. And I talk a lot about cancer, and I don't talk about sex and puberty, and that gets brought up, and my answer really is just, it really is a preventable cancer. So kind of regardless of how you feel about the mode of transmission, it's cancer prevention. You need to think about this vaccine as preventing cancers. You'll hear a lot about sandwiching the HPV in the middle, which I think is true. You got to normalize it. I don't think that that staff always gets this. This does require a lot of training. And so we did really, and we need to do it again because our staff has turned over a lot, and I know that we're not doing as good of a job anymore, but we need to really intentionally train staff to phrase this in a normative way. So it's not like, well, school requires DTaP and meningococcal vaccine, and then do you want to do the HPV or not? That's just the worst possible way to address it. So these are the vaccines you're due for. And then they say, well, I have questions about that one. Totally fine. I'll have Dr. Crick talk to you about it. But to not make it sort of that other vaccine or that one that we don't like to talk about or separated in some way, it has to be normalized as this is something we do for all of our patients at this age. And if you have questions, we're happy to talk about why and address your concerns. And then I had said before, I do ask permission even when they totally shut me down. No, I'm not interested. Okay, we don't need to have a discussion about it. Do you mind if I ask you again next year? And sometimes they say, please don't ever ask me again. But usually they say, that's totally fine. I'm impressed at how many parents say no just because they don't know anything about it or have heard vaguely something bad, but they can't even express what they've heard, that when I have the conversation, they go, oh, we should just do that. And then, pediatricians have all heard, describe your experiences with your own family. So I got 4 kids. They've all had this vaccine. I have absolutely no concerns whatsoever about this vaccine. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that area. And as you saw from Dr. Karas's slides, that this is an area of need. We're all way below where we'd like to be in terms of HPV vaccination rates. So fertile ground for PDSAs in this area. All right, next slide. You might be almost done. So AAP called this measurement, and I put in the caption, know your vaccination rates. If you know where you stand individually as a practice in your area and against national rates, you're in a much better position to understand the work that needs to be done or where the work needs to be done. I mean, our practice DTAP rates are very, very high. TDAP, I think actually are actually very high, 90 plus, 92 or something. Our HPV rates are way better than they were before we did a lot of interventions several years ago. But I think they're hovering around 80 and really could be a lot better. And then, you know, to dive deeper and actually look at like, what are my rates? How, you know, am I doing better than this? Because I mean, I think it's natural to think, well, I do a good job with this. I'm kind of right there with everybody else. It turns out that I'm not doing a better job with this than anybody else. So knowing that you have work to do, or that you don't have work to do, let's not spend a ton of time on TDAP, because that's just not the area of need in our situation. We really have a big miss with HPV. And then the other area that I would identify for my practice is kind of missed opportunities with acute care visits. So be aware of what your needs are, what your practice needs are, where you stand, so that you can develop interventions that really make a bigger difference. Next slide. So in summary, PDSA cycles and interventions can lead to improvement in adolescent immunization rates. And the AAP-CQN has identified the top 10 interventions that have been shown to be effective in improving vaccine rates. And the red is just, it's not really a summary of anything I said, but something that I think we all recognize that, you know, why are we doing this? That, you know, routine vaccine immunizations saves thousands of lives, millions of cases of disease and morbidity, and billions of healthcare dollars. I mean, that's, you know, keep that in mind. You all know that, but this is why we do this work that we do. And I think that's it. There might be a question slide. Nope. Are there any questions? Are there any, I don't know, comments about anything that I've talked about? I don't have my chat box up, but I'll put it up. So I think we can move on, but, you know, at any point, if anybody has questions or comments or thoughts on anything that we've said today, throw it in the chat box.
Thank you, Dr. Crick. That was great.